is a Counterpoint program about drug-induced AIDS. Our two guests on a previous program saw a link between AIDS and drug usage, especially crack cocaine. Both also condemn the usage of toxic chemicals such as AZT as a therapeutic treatment for HIV or AIDS, and reject the theory that HIV, commonly called the AIDS virus, is the sole cause of AIDS. 4 viewers, all seemingly very reputable, were highly critical of those views, among other statements by Dr. Nathaniel Lehrman and Mr. John Lauritsen, author of a new book, The AIDS War. In order to set the record straight, I wrote to the 4 viewers, inviting them to appear and refute the statements. No one agreed to appear, and the 2 who did respond to my letter explicitly denied me permission to read any part of their letter or use their names. I will respect their wishes. However, they raised objections held by the vast majority of the public whose only exposure is the government's premise that a virus named HIV causes AIDS all by itself, the HIV-AIDS hypothesis. Out of concern to everyone seeking to advance medical knowledge and the public's right to know, we have asked Dr. J.D. Robinson, a physician, writer, and professor of medicine, to react to the claims of Dr. Lehrman and Mr. Lauritsen. I'm Tony Brown. In a moment, AIDS Counterpoint.
Tony Brown's Journal is brought to you by Pepsi and its bottlers. This program is a part of Pepsi-Cola's continuing support of your community's cultural, educational, and business interests.
Dr. Nathaniel Lehrman is a psychiatrist and former clinical director of Kingsborough Psychiatric Center in New York. He is now working on a new book. Our next guest is Dr. J.D. Robinson, who practices internal medicine in Washington, D.C., and is working on a new book entitled, Unlike Any Other, AIDS Intimacy and Vulnerability. Our next guest is Mr. John Lauritsen. Mr. Lauritsen is the author of Poison by Prescription, and the title of his new book is The AIDS War. Gentlemen, thank you for coming and being with us, and especially to you, Dr. Robinson. We've asked you to come in and to react on behalf of some of the viewers who reacted to the previous statements of our other 2 guests. You have viewed the tape of that program. Where do you differ with some or all of the statements made?
Well, I think there's a compelling argument for HIV, the AIDS virus, as being the underlying common theme and cause of AIDS, which is not to say that there are not other associated factors. But there's a long list of experimental studies now and results done in many laboratories all over the world that show the effects of the HIV virus. For example, if you cultivate T cells, the target cells of the virus with HIV, you can cause them to be killed. They have a receptor on the surface called the CD4 receptor. The virus binds to it. A very strong lock and key reaction will kill the cells. If you study people who have HIV virus from when they convert to seropositivity or showing evidence of the virus, and you follow them over a prolonged period of time, you will see a gradual decline in their immune competence. They lose, on the average, about 10 T cells a month. Normal people who are not affected have anywhere from 800 to 1,200 T cells by the count that we measure. You start to get into immune problems when you get below 400, 300, certainly below 200. If you follow 1,000 people who are seropositive, you will find them on the average losing about 10 per month, which fits in very well with this hypothesis of the incubation period being as long as 10 or 12 years. You have the cases of transfusion-associated HIV transmission, where people who have none of these behavioral characteristics of either using drugs or having had other venereal diseases come down with HIV simply because they were given a transfusion. In fact, that was the initial clue, one of the initial clues to the fact that there was a transmissible infectious agent. There are cases where 3 or 4 or 5 individuals got blood from an infected person. They all come down with HIV. So they don't have these behavioral characteristics.
Dr. Robinson, is it possible to answer with a yes or no the following question. And if it's not, help me understand why. If it is, please give me a yes or no. Is HIV the single and sole cause of what we describe as AIDS?
Well, let me give you an analogy. Is the virus of chickenpox the sole cause of chickenpox? You could argue that children going to school is one of the underlying factors in promoting the spread of chickenpox, and that is correct. But they have to be exposed to the virus in order to get the chickenpox. So you could say that crowding and associating with other children is a cause of chickenpox. Yes, that's true to some extent. But the fact is that the sine qua non of AIDS is having the HIV virus. Once you have that on board, there's a steady, persistent decline in the T-cell population. When you get to certain low levels, 200 as a landmark, you start to get into all kinds of
Can I get a yes
problems.
or no?
No.
The answer is
you can get a no to the question, can you get a yes or no, but you can't get a yes or no to the question.
All right. Now, is in your mind the use of AZT, a toxic chemical, in your mind, do you recommend it as a therapy for what we call AIDS?
Well, AZT will cause a transient improvement in the immune condition of people who are carrying HIV. Typically, you will see a rise in the T-cell count of 100 to 200 T-cells, and in fact, that effect wears off after about 24 to 30 months pretty much because you continue on this decline, rough average 8 to 12 T-cells per month. AZT, when you say it's a toxic chemical, I mean all drugs that are administered could be said to be toxic in one degree or another. Aspirin has potentially very toxic side effects. We give a drug for a purpose. We call the effects we want the effects. We call all the other effects side effects.
But was not, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I am not a doctor,
Okay.
Was AZT not created to destroy DNA cell synthesis, which is the foundation of the body's survival?
Not quite. Close, but not quite. The AZT interferes with a step in the synthesis of AZT, which is not a normal synthesis. In other words, normally DNA is used to make templates of what's called RNA, which then produces the proteins, the hormones, the structural elements of cells. In the case of the AIDS virus, HIV, this is an RNA virus, a slightly different type of genetic material, which through something called reverse transcriptase, which everyone by now has probably heard of, reverse engineers itself back up to DNA and incorporates itself into the DNA of the cell. The AZT attacks this step of reverse engineering RNA back to DNA. That is not a normal step in the physiology of the human body. So yes, while AZT is a toxic medication in high enough doses, in the doses in which it's generally used, that is not the case. Most of the people who've taken AZT in what are now reduced doses from the original protocols, in fact, have an increased sense of well-being, do feel good, reduce the number of symptoms.
Does it not destroy DNA cell synthesis?
It doesn't destroy normal DNA cell synthesis. It only destroys this aberrant DNA synthesis whereby you're going from RNA back up to DNA. That is not the way your body or my body works. DNA is the long set of blueprints coiled up in a helix that tells our bodies how to build themselves, okay? RNA being turned back into DNA and incorporated into our cells is not a normal physiologic step.
My final point with you, and then we're going to bring in Dr. Lehrman and Mr. Lauritsen to let them respond. My final point is, as you know, Dr. Lehrman in particular states and believes that there is a link between what we call AIDS and the usage of drugs, particularly crack cocaine. He cites, as you saw in the previous program, Belglade, Florida, as an example, the high incidence of AIDS being drug-induced. What is your opinion on that?
Well, there's no question that there is this association. And when we're talking about non-intravenous drugs, such as crack cocaine, the association, you have to find what is the meaning of the association, okay? I mean, we could argue that government spending is a direct reflection of the number of thermal units of air conditioning in Washington, D.C., were it not for a large number of air conditioning units in Washington, D.C., Congress wouldn't stay in session all year long. They wouldn't spend nearly so much money. They wouldn't do a lot of the things they do. I mean, when you make an association, you have to say, well, what is the association? With crack cocaine, It is that people go on these crack binges. They have sex with multiple partners over a period of sometimes 2, 3, 4 days. Women in particular trade sexual favors for the drug, and so you set up, therefore, a highly favorable circumstance for the sexual transmission of the infectious agent, HIV.
All right, Dr. Lehrman?
I think that Dr. Robinson has just made a very important point, that correlation is not causation. He feels that correlation is not causation with regard to crack, and some of us feel that correlation is not causation with regard to HIV. I want to give a little story that's not true, but it's valuable. Once upon a time, there was an alcohol researcher who found that his subjects drank gin and tonic, vodka and tonic, and rye and tonic. And after much study and computer work, came to the conclusion that the cause of alcoholism was tonic water. Whereupon a vast new industry arose based on, to try to find out why quinine, the active ingredient in tonic water, causes alcoholism. I think the same kind of thing has happened with AIDS. I think that in terms of the point that Dr. Robinson makes about the HIV and the virus, HIV's transmissibility differs immensely from that of genuine transmitted diseases, sexually transmitted diseases. Two sexual encounters are usually required for the development of frank syphilis, 2 or 3 for the development of frank gonorrhea, about 6 or 7 for hepatitis. Now, when you come to AIDS, 200 sexual encounters are required, on the average, between 100 and 200, for the development of HIV seropositivity, which is not the AIDS itself. The AIDS numbers are much, much smaller. And I think that there's a qualitative difference between these in terms of infectivity. On the other hand, we do know, and we've known for years, that drugs, heroin, crack, cocaine, all of these things, can cause immune deficiencies. They've done it long before AIDS was ever defined. And I think that I would disagree with Dr. Robinson. I think that the correlation is causative when you're dealing with drugs, and the correlation is not causative when you're dealing with HIV. Now, one last point in terms of infectious diseases. American medicine and the Public Health Service have sometimes been overly concerned or overly interested in infectious causes and ignoring other causes, environmental or whatever. And the case I want to cite was the situation with pellagra in the 1920s, which was seen as an infectious disease of corn farmers in the South, until Goldberger discovered that it was caused by a vitamin deficiency. I think that there was another episode also in Japan where an illness caused by a toxic agent in the environment was also blamed on infectious diseases. Now, I thought immediately I heard about this AIDS business that HIV might be causing it, but other things might be causing it also. However, we have had a blitzkrieg that AIDS is the only cause, and HIV is the only cause of AIDS, and any other possibilities have been systematically excluded. And people who have disagreed with that have suffered for it.
Do you rule out any other possibility as a cofactor?
Oh, there's no question there are cofactors. Let me just respond to 2 of those things. One is, yes, there has been an epidemic of drug abuse in the United States going back 40 years preceding the outbreak of HIV disease, of AIDS. And if that were the underlying feature that was impairing the immune system, we should have seen AIDS by 1945 or 1950. That, in fact, has not happened. With regard to infectivity in terms of sexual transmission, it is true that it may require a large number of sexual contacts to transmit HIV from one individual to another, and probably it's substantially more efficient from male to female. At the same time, there are clearly documented cases where it's only required 1 or 2
now,
contacts.
I can't get you to give me a yes or no on that. Go ahead.
Let me just finish one point about the infectivity, though, that as the disease state progresses, the longer after seroconversion, the longer it is from when a person acquired HIV, the more infectious they become. The people who transmit HIV the easiest to their sexual partners are the ones who've had it for a longer period of time, so that at 7, 8, 9 years. And what we know about these people is they have a much higher viral level of HIV in their blood and a much lower level of the CD4 cells that are protecting them.
I want to move on. I want to get one brief response. I don't want to lose this this question, the sole cause. HIV is the sole cause of AIDS. I know you told me you weren't going to answer it. I want to ask it another way. Dr. Robert Gallo, I think in 1984, stated that it was the sole cause of AIDS. HIV was the sole cause of AIDS. Do you disagree with Dr. Robert Gallo's statement?
I think that if I had to give a short answer, but there are a long series of qualifications, the answer is yes. HIV is the cause of the immunodeficiency syndrome, which turns into AIDS as the disease progresses. And probably the proper terminology would be to call it HIV disease, which in its earlier phases has very few manifestations, if any, and as time goes on with this decline in the immune system has increasingly severe manifestations.
All right, now, Mr. Larson, we now are in a phase in which Dr. Robert Gallo, who is the superstar AIDS researcher of the federal government, has had difficulty with the government investigating unit. Where do you put all of this in context?
Okay, in context, I think the AIDS orthodoxies are collapsing. One example is the fact that we're having a show like this, which would not have happened a number of years ago. Another is that Robert Gallo, who until recently was considered the United States' foremost expert on AIDS, was found guilty of scientific misconduct by the committee you mentioned. Several of Gallo's closest associates have either been convicted of felonies or are under indictment for them. This does not look good.
We have to be careful. We can't document statements such as that, Mr. Larson.
Okay, forget that.
I don't know anything about his associates being indicted. And,
okay.
Yeah.
People are becoming...
I just want to say that since they're not here on their behalf, I do want to say that we have no evidence that that statement is true.
So do you want to do that over or what?
No, go right ahead.
Oh. Okay, censorship is lifting. People are becoming angry because they have been duped by the propaganda of the last few years. People believe HIV is the cause of AIDS because that's all they've heard. It's very much like children who believe that there's a Santa Claus because they are not willing to believe their parents would lie to them. It's the closest example I can think of. Now, I disagreed with many points Dr. Robinson made, but I think it's important to see the forest as well as the trees. I want to hit just two specific points. One is transfusions. And according to the most complete study I know, which appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine in 5 October 1989, they studied people who had received blood transfusions which contained HIV. This was before screening. And they compared them with people who got blood transfusions which did not contain HIV. Of those who got blood which contained HIV, 1 year later, 48% of these people were dead. However, of those who got transfusions which did not contain HIV, 50% of these people were dead a year later. People who need a transfusion have a poor prognosis because they're very sick in the first place, and also transfusions are not good for people. Now, looking only at those people who got blood which had HIV and who died a year later, of those people, there were 437, only 3% died of so-called AIDS. The other 97% died of causes which had absolutely nothing to do with AIDS. So much for transfusions.
What about Brian White? Did Brian White, the famous AIDS poster boy, die of AIDS?
An excellent point, an excellent point. No, he died of hemophilia, and this is an example of the censorship.
Hemophilia means bleeding?
Bleeding. He was admitted to the hospital with uncontrolled internal bleeding. This was reported in the electronic media, television and radio. It was then censored from the later print media, from the New York Times. A few days after he was admitted to the hospital, he died, and this was totally excluded from the obituary. An associate of Peter Duisberg then called the Hemophilia Foundation of his state. They said, yes, he did die of hemophilia. He had terrible hemophilia, which required factor VIII every single day, and that was the cause of his death, plus probably ACT poisoning. This is one example of the incredible censorship we had. Why should they censor the fact that a hemophiliac died of hemophilia?
What do you, how do you respond to that, Dr. Robinson?
Hemophilia is not a new disease, and the fact that unfortunately a large proportion of hemophiliacs became infected with HIV in the early 1980s is just a sad story, but hemophiliacs were not dying at anything approaching this rate of any syndromes remotely like what is now happening to hemophiliacs.
So you're saying that the hemophiliacs who do get the HIV infection are at greater risk than they would have been.
Oh, vastly greater risk.
Are you saying that the HIV infection doesn't matter?
That is not a correct statement. The only studies which compared HIV positive hemophiliacs with HIV negative did not find a difference in mortality.
And you conclude from that what? That the HIV infection is not important?
I'd have to take a few steps backwards. I regard the basic construct of AIDS as phony. It started out with two indicator diseases, Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. And the idea was that somehow underneath it was a condition of immune deficiency, which was then believed to be caused by a new retrovirus. You never see the immune deficiency, you only see the consequences. The surveillance definition was expanded again, and again. We're now up to 30 indicator diseases. The idea is you can have one of these things which include many types of lung disease, cancer, wasting, dementia.
Now tuberculosis, isn't it? I think tuberculosis, has it not been added?
That's right.
The most recent definition?
It speaks to the underlying importance of the immune system. The immune system is what differentiates, it enables us to differentiate ourselves from the rest of the world in biological terms. And without this ability to separate ourselves, we're subject to all kinds of invaders. It is our fundamental defense system. If you impair it, you will get a long list of diseases. In fact, just as of the beginning of 1993, the definition of AIDS has been expanded and rationalized to include individuals with HIV and T-cell counts that have fallen below 200.
What do you?
So that will create a more level playing field. It will cause a transient jump in the number of cases, but it will create a more level playing field. There are huge numbers of manifestations to immunodeficiency syndromes. You know, immunodeficiency syndromes have existed before HIV. There are congenital ones. There are people who've been on steroids or other drugs who have immune deficiency states. And there is a body of experience with these disorders. And people who have this impairment are subject to getting a wide variety of infections. Street drugs, don't forget, people who were injecting street drugs were also injecting a series of pathogens. I mean, a common infection of IV drug users is endocarditis.
How about non-intravenous drug users? Do they have immune deficiencies?
I don't think that the use of non-intravenous drugs is a primary cause of immune deficiencies, no.
Is it a significant one?
Because there's a strong correlation which has been reported on between crack cocaine and AIDS.
Of course there is. That is because people who are on crack cocaine have large numbers of sexual partners, often with people in the risk groups.
Evidence for it, not one bit.
It's the self-reported behavior of crack cocaine users.
No evidence whatever.
Now, in terms of the usage of drugs, do you see that as a primary factor in terms of the development of what we call AIDS, or do you not see it as a factor at all?
Well, I think this. When a person gets HIV, the virus, okay, it gets into these immune cells of the body, not just the T cells, but other cells as well. And when you get any incidental infection, you might get an infected hair follicle on your skin, you might get a flu, you might get a gastroenteritis. Each time you get an infection, that stimulates the immune system to produce cells to fight off that particular infection. Now, if those cells are carrying the HIV virus, it will then be expressed at that time, and that whole, what we call clone of cells, is likely to get nipped off in addition to producing more virus in the body. You see, the virus incorporates itself into the DNA of the normal cells of the immune system. It sits there as a provirus. This is why it's only recently that the extent of the infection of immune cells has been appreciated with newer techniques.
Doctor, I hate to interrupt you. Go ahead.
You mentioned that there are several other causes of immune deficiency. Steroids, malnutrition is certainly one of them, although you didn't mention it. But you're speaking as though the only cause of immune deficiency is HIV.
No.
Now, wait a minute. In drug users, for example, malnutrition, because they don't eat, is a major cause of immune deficiency.
We have 1 minute. I'd like anyone to answer this. I think we're up to about our 6th, 7th, 9th, whatever it is, redefinition of AIDS by the Centers for Disease Control. Is this now becoming a political definition or a scientific definition, Dr. Robinson? Very briefly.
Scientific.
I think political.
Political?
Yeah.
Mr. Larson?
Political, and it's become more and more irrational and crazy as opposed to rational.
Dr. Robinson, do you feel that people who differ with the HIV/AIDS hypothesis are doing a credible service or a disservice to the exploration of a solution to this epidemic?
Well, John Stuart Mill said that the best way to arrive at the truth was to expose all theories and hypotheses to rational debate, and then those which are correct will be strengthened by the tension or battle between right and wrong, and those that are wrong will be shown to be wrong. Those that are correct will be really enhanced by that debate.
Thank you. I would like to say before we leave, on behalf of Dr. Robert Gallo, that he is appealing the decision, and he says that the decision is not accurate. I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, for being with me on this program. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.